This is Sam Black with Drafting Archetypes, and today I'm going to be taking a first look at Foundations. Foundations, for anyone who's been living under a rock relative to Magic, is the upcoming rebirth of core sets, I suppose, that's going to be standard legal for the foreseeable future and introduces a very large number of cards to standard. However, many of the cards that are introduced are not in regular Foundations booster packs, I think. I know that it's introducing Guild Gates, but the Guild Gates aren't in booster packs, for example. So there's some kind of larger product. I'm not the right person to be going into the details here, I guess. Some kind of larger product, and then also a draftable set that is a subset of the larger product. So what I'm going to be looking at, of course, is just the draftable set, starting with kind of the archetypes and my usual pre-playing with overview of what's happening in the set. So I started by both looking at the archetypes as the official documentation claims they exist, and then doing a deeper dive into the set file to see how supported I thought those look personally and how much I think they're going to actually matter in limited format. So, for example, blue-white, the stated archetype is flying, but there's not a lot of support for flying matters. I think it's just Empyrean Eagle, the uncommon 2/3 flyer that blue-white that pumps all of you, that gives all your flyers +1/+1. There are like 3 common blue flyers and 3 common white flyers. And of like all of the white common flyers, gain life or care about gaining life, which is the black-white theme. And one of the blue flyers is Mocking Sprite, which discounts your instants and sorceries. And if you're not doing anything with that, it's a 3-mana 2/1. So it seems like there's not really payoffs for having flyers, and there aren't really that many flyers, and you wouldn't really want to play them. And if you did, you'd want to, like, other archetypes would want them more than you do. So this to me seems very solidly like kind of blue-white no theme. Like, it's just a blue-white deck that, you know, sometimes those care about having evasive creatures for some reason, but I really don't think that in practice you're going to feel the flying archetype. Not much more to say about that. This is one of those don't believe their lies type situations. It's not even like there's some kind of like trap or like theme that might not come together. It's just not even there. With the exception of the kind of like misleading signpost. Blue-black's stated theme is graveyard, with the signpost uncommon having threshold and an ability that kind of fills the graveyard. There are basically no commons that are efficient at filling your graveyard. The closest we have is like Light Shell Duo's Surveil 2. So this is another theme that seems pretty loose, mostly suggests that you'll want to play a long game to fill your graveyard because you kind of have to do it the hard way. So to me, this is analogous to when they just say that like blue-black's theme is control. There are, you know, a few scattered uncommons that like care about threshold or whatever, but the support for it is loose. Red-black's stated theme is raid, which is the mechanic that does something if you've attacked this turn. That mechanic exists in both red and black and nowhere else, so it will be nice to be able to attack and trigger it. But I kind of think it's more significant that there's a common threaten in red in Involuntary Employment, which is the 4-mana steal a creature until end of turn, untap it, give it haste, make a treasure. And then the treasure gives you the 1 mana that you would need to sacrifice a creature that you steal to the commons Hungry Ghoul or Eaten Alive. Eaten Alive is a reprint of a Bone Splitters variant from Midnight Hunt. And the Hungry Ghoul is a 2/2 for 2. You can spend a colorless and sacrifice a creature to put a +1/+1 counter on it. So we have two efficient 1 mana, like, need to spend 1 mana to sacrifice a creature, things at common and threaten at common. So I kind of think, really, like, Steel and Sack will be as relevant to what Red Black is doing as Raid, if not more, even though there's only like the single common that steals stuff. A single common that steals stuff goes pretty far because no one else ever wants those, so they all table. Red Green's theme is Power 4 plus. Again, there's not a ton that cares about it. Courageous Goblin is a 2/2 that gets bigger if you have a 4 power creature at common. I think outside of that, it's just 3 uncommons. All reprints: Nessian Hornbeetle, Ruby, the red-green legend that taps for mana and gets like bigger if you have a big creature, and from Wilds of Eldraine, and Garruk's Uprising, and then a couple rares that care about 4 power. I'm never much of a believer in the red-green 4 power stuff. It's always, I don't know, kind of lame and half-hearted. Like, I think, as usual, red-green will not be terribly successful or all that commonly drafted, but decks that are red-green will probably have some of the payoffs. And I don't know, it might overperform, but I mostly think with the ramp stuff being relevant, I wouldn't be surprised if this ends up being more of like a teamer big stuff kind of space more often. Green-white's theme is +1/+1 counters. There are a good number of ways to get +1/+1 counters, but I don't think there are very many cards that care about having +1/+1 counters. I think it's only Inspiring Call, Wildwood Scourge, and Inspiring Paladin. The uncommons, Inspiring Call and Wildwood Surge, are reprints. Inspiring Call puts a +1/+1 counter on something and draws a card for each creature you have that has a +1/+1 counter. Wildwood Scourge gets a +1/+1 counter whenever something else gets a +1/+1 counter. And then Inspiring Paladin is a 3 mana 3/3 common that has first strike on your turn and gives all of your creatures with +1/+1 counters on them first strike during your turn. Wildwood Scourge and Inspiring Call are potentially reasonably high impact cards, but they need to do a ton of heavy lifting to make this archetype feel like it really cares about having +1/+1 counters. There are enough ways to get +1/+1 counters, and Wildwood Scourge and Inspiring Call are impactful enough that I do think that decks that care about this will come up, but I don't know that I think that all or even most green-white decks will really care about it. You might have like one payoff for it or whatever. So that's all of the allied colors. I think most of the allied color themes seem pretty loose to me. The enemy colors generally or broadly seem a little bit more supported with some exceptions. So White-Black's theme is life gain. There are a good number of payoffs for gaining life. You have Marauding Blight Priest, the 3 mana 3/2 that makes your opponent lose life whenever you gain a life. Vanguard Seraph, which is like 4 mana-ish. Some kind of common flyer that surveils the first time you gain life each turn. Ajani's Pridemate, notable powerful life gain payoff. A 2 mana 1/1 that gets a +1/+1 counter whenever you gain life. Cat Collector, a 3 mana that makes a 1/1 whenever you gain life, maybe only once each turn. Fiendish Panda is the black-white uncommon that gets a +1/+1 counter when you gain life, and then when it dies, you get to return something to your hand based on how big it is. I think that's like a decent amount of support. There's a lot of life gain. So I think it's like realistically supported in terms of like number of cards. The power level I'm not totally sure about, but it seems potentially real. Blue-red is a spells deck. The payoffs are Elemental Adept, which is a 2 mana 2/1 flash prowess. Firebrand Archer, which is a 2 mana 2/1 whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, deal 1 damage to your opponent. Crackling Cyclops, which is like an 0/4, I think, that gets +3/+0 when you play an instant or sorcery for 3 mana. Light Shell Duo, which is the Prowess Surveil Otter. Mocking Sprite, the 2/1 that makes stuff cost less. Tolarian Terror, which I think is reprinted on Uncommon now. The 5/5 hexproof, or Ward 2, that costs 1 less for each instant sorcery in your graveyard. Balmor, the flyer that kind of gives all your guys prowess. Arcane Epiphany is a 5 mana instant, draw 3 that costs 4 if you control a wizard, and there are wizards in both red and blue. Brineborn Cutthroat gets a +1/+1 counter if you play something during your opponent's turn, which is mostly going to happen in blue-red. And then Heartfire Immolator is 2/2 prowess that can sack to deal damage equal to its power to something. So again, a pretty good amount of support there, and a lot of those are pretty strong cards. There are a few instants and sorceries that make tokens, which is, of course, a way to increase your spell density by replacing creatures with spells that make creatures. Not a ton relative to a set like Strixhaven or something that's really leaning into being about the spells thing, but I think that there are enough like cantrips and I think like Thrill of Possibility and these like prowess things that blue-red certainly seems like it can be real. Green-black, on the other hand, its stated theme is morbid. There are not very many cards that have the word morbid on them, and morbid's always generally pretty hard to support. I think this is going to be more of a generic, like, graveyard recursion type situation with some amount of sacrifice synergies thrown in. Overall, pretty loose, but I think you're going to be able to, like, play the kind of green-black game plan you would expect. I just don't know that, like, the morbid word in particular is all that meaningful. A little bit like Raid and red-black. You know, it's a mechanic that's present, but not a mechanic that, like, highly informs, like, deck building. Red-white's stated theme is aggro. I hate when they do that, as a side note. I think that I would specify more of like a wide aggro type or tokens type theme here, though there aren't really that many cards that let you go wide, but the ones that are, I think, matter. Goblin Surprise is pretty significant. It's a split card, Trumpet Blast effect. All your creatures, by split card, I just mean modal spell. All your creatures get +2/+0 until end of turn, or make 2 goblins for 3 mana. And then Resolute Reinforcements is here at Uncommon, 1/1 flash, make a 1/1. And then Heroic Reinforcements is the Signpost. 4 mana, make 2 1/1s, and give all your creatures +1/+1 and haste until end of turn. This card is very powerful, very impactful. I think that you don't really need a lot to exist other than Heroic Reinforcements and a few ways to make tokens for Heroic Reinforcements to be a really significant card. This is the token stuff. There is also another go wide pump spell in 5 mana. All your creatures get +2/+2, cost 1 less for each cat you control. So I think that the make token stuff is going to be a priority for red-white. There's not that much of it, especially if you're not counting things like 6 mana, 1/1 lifelink, make 2 3/3s, which isn't a bad card. It's just not really like a red-white aggro card. And if you can get a good amount of the token maker stuff, then there are a lot of payoffs for going wide. So I think, you know, anytime a red-white deck gets like a couple Heroic Reinforcements, it's going to do pretty well. So I'm certainly going to respect red-white, and given how big of a draw Heroic Reinforcements is, I think you kind of need to expect that most of your red-white deck, your red-white opponents are going to have it as like the card that put them into red-white. Blue-green is listed as ramp, but really I think this is just like 5-color green, and it's pretty well supported, which is a smooth transition to looking at the fixing in the set. So green has both Bushwhack, which is green, search for a basic, put it in your hand, or target creature you control fights target creature you don't control. And Grow from the Ashes, which is 2 and a green, rampant growth, kicker 2, rampant growth again. And then Burnished Heart, 3 mana to play, 2/2, 3 and sack. Search for 2 basics, put them into play tapped at uncommon. Gold Vein Pick, Campus Guide, Heraldic Banner at uncommon, common gain lands, all 10 of them, and Evolving Wilds. It's a lot of fixing. Having 2 green commons that find any color, one of which can find 2 different colors, is really significant. I think that it's... Yeah, I think the amount of fixing is very significant. I think the fact that the dual lands are gain lands is significant. That generally favors control over aggro, of course. And yeah, so that's what's going on there. I think most of the archetypes, as I've gone over, are pretty loose. We only have 1 gold uncommon for each color pair, contrasted with most sets these days, which have 2. And, you know, a lot of the themes are pretty broad, not very well supported. So core sets typically have been relatively low synergy, more just like, here are some normal Magic cards, play a game with them. And I think that this is not an exception from that. I think that we're going to see successful aggressive and or linear 2-color decks, and that those will mostly be subsets of the Mardu color combinations. And then I think that there will be a lot of like soupy / multicolor, more controlling type decks that will usually, but not always, be green based. You can certainly do the like non-green multicolor thing that I'm usually a fan of by prioritizing Gainlands and Evolving Wilds. And yeah, I think that's going to be kind of the central dynamic of this format, is these like kind of scary, aggressive, and or deeply linear stuff with like the steal and sack or the life gain thing, or like the red white go white aggro. There will be some amount of like green aggro, either like red green or green whites, but it'll be mostly like multicolor, more controlling green decks. There obviously can exist, you know, like the linear like blue-red spells deck or some kind of like dedicated blue-white control deck. But I kind of think though, like blue-white, like I think that blue is very frequently going to exist in decks that are playing 3 or more colors. I think the most common 2-color blue deck will probably be blue-red, followed by, I guess, blue-black, just because I don't really know why you would be blue-white. But then again, blue-white lends itself more to being like 2-color, a little bit more aggressive, whereas blue-black's more controlling, so there's less reason not to splash. But I mostly see blue and green as primarily multicolor decks or colors or whatever. And the Mardu stuff is primarily 2 colors. Of course, you know, frequently being splashed into the multicolor decks. And that's kind of my first impression as to what's going on here. I have no reason to believe that like blocking will be particularly punished. There are mechanics that encourage attacking, like raid, but there aren't really mechanics that like punish blocking the way that like exert or something does. I haven't deeply studied the, you know, exactly like how much removal there is and how it lines up with the various creatures and stuff like that. Obviously, I wait on thinking a lot about like strength of colors or power level of archetypes beyond, like, I'm looking more at how well supported are their themes rather than how strong are the individual cards. So it's possible that blue-white might end up being a very successful archetype because the blue and white cards could be very strong. I just don't believe that it's a flying archetype. So this is more speaking to like what kind of mindset you should have going into these colors and what sorts of things you should be looking for them to do. So, with that said, I'm going to turn it over to chat for questions for additional discussion. And as always, I will plug the Patreon at this time. So if you're looking to support the podcast, be sure to check out patreon.com/draftingarchetypes to, on a scale of immaculate to not immaculate, how would you say that you find the vibes of Foundations? I think they're pretty good. I don't love all of the limited archetypes, but a lot of the individual cards are clean, satisfying, cute. I think this set on first impression doesn't hit as well for its time as M10 did for me, but I do like things in that direction. And this definitely has a lot of, like, I like the cards that are reprinted. I think a lot of them are cards that have made previous limited formats fun. So overall, I would say, like, I'd give this set on first impression a B if I'm, like, grading pretty harshly, which it's rare for me to commit to a grade like that at all. I'm kind of surprised that I'm doing it, but I guess I do have enough access to an opinion since it's a lot of reprints that's what I think right now. Do you think the rares are going to be a significant enough part of the format that things like witness protection could be playable? So, obviously, I believe we're still in the age of play boosters. I think the booster composition in this set is going to be similar to what we've seen. And, there are, like, fewer commons in the set because of that. I haven't studied, like, my focus here has been on studying the rares and uncommons, so I've, like, briefly looked at most of the rares and mythics, but haven't really studied them. I assume, as always, this is limited, and rares and mythics are going to be significant. As to how good is witness protection, I will say that Unable to Scream has set a really good precedent for witness protection. Like, the difference between witness protection and Unable to Scream is witness protection makes it a 1/1 instead of an 0/2, and I do think an 0/2, like, making something an 0/2 is a lot better than making something a 1/1. It's a lot harder for them to get value out of having an 0/2, but Unable to Scream was so good, although a lot of that is because of Eerie synergies, that it makes me feel more optimistic about, like, yeah, witness protection is probably fine. So, I mean, as far as, like, it's hard to, know how much of this question is, do we need to play removal to be able to answer rares, and how much of this question is witness protection acceptable as a removal spell? But I think the answer to both of those is a soft yes. Do I think the amount of overrun type effects will have a major effect on the format speed/blocking? Right, so the actual card overrun is an uncommon in this set, I believe. Overrun is certainly a meaningful card. This is a card that has been at various points in the past, like, the Mythic Uncommon or whatever, before we had that language, because Mythics didn't exist at the time. It speaks to, like, Overrun existing means that you can't necessarily reliably plan to just, like, have a board stall and block if you don't have Overrun in your deck. You're trying to play control, you need to be careful about your ability to, like, manage the number of creatures your opponent has. Incidentally, I think a reasonable plan against, like, control would be to have Revenge of Rats, the 2/BB sorcery that makes a tapped 1/1 black rat for each creature in your graveyard and has flashback. So if your opponent's killing your creatures, you can Revenge of Rats, make a bunch of rats, and then overrun with the rats. So, yeah, I think Overrun is, like, structurally meaningfully different than, like, the red and white pump your team stuff in terms of, like, exactly how game ending it is on stalled boards. But Yeah, I mean, I think that the fact that there are a lot of ways to kind of like break open a game if there's a board stall is intentional. I think that core sets and low synergy environments in general are more likely to lead to board stalls because there are fewer kind of like linear synergies to do something strong and proactive. You're more likely to just have like creatures kind of staring at each other. You don't want the games to go forever. So you have these like board stall breakers. And yeah, that certainly pushes toward you need to be doing something. But the thing that you're doing could be like building overwhelming card advantage and then turning that into like removal to keep the board small or whatever. So I'm not going to claim that these cards aren't impactful, that like mass pump is significant, especially in the age where like making tokens is pretty easy. Like most of the time that we've seen actual overrun in the past, I think it was a lot harder to make tokens than it is these days. And I don't believe that there's like a fog effect to counter an overrun. So, yeah, overrun matters, and you should plan accordingly. Do we think decks will be bomb dependent, or are the commons uncommons strong enough to stand alone, given the weak synergy? My guess is the former. I think it's limited, and bomb dependent is more perspective question. Like, if you can't answer a powerful card, it'll win the game, but it's not difficult to trade low rarity heart cards with high rarity cards, and you can still win games by curving out, and you can curve out with low rarity cards. No fog, but Aetherize exists. That's a good point. Aetherize is 4 mana, bounce all attacking creatures, which is a card that I was like a little bit underwhelmed by, but pointing out its role in interacting with the mass pump stuff makes me a little bit more optimistic about it. Though, you know, a lot of that's going to be maybe don't play your like mass pump into 4 open mana. Like the fact that Aetherize costs a ton of mana means it's like pretty hard to hold up. So you kind of have to work to be able to plan to use that. Time stop is also a fog, sort of. That's true. That's pretty close. I mean, that's basically just saying you can counter it, though. I'm not smart enough to figure out whether Revenge of Rats will be a thing when Rise of Varmints was not. That's valid. I'm also not sure how significant Revenge of the Rats will be. There's very, very, very little like self-mill, and like the fact that, you know, if you want to think of this as like a spider spawning reprint, like spider spawning gave you 1/2 creatures with reach. Those block really well. This gives you tapped 1/1s, so it like doesn't stabilize immediately at all. I certainly am not like a believer in Revenge of Rats as a powerful archetype. I don't know if the card will end up being playable. I am going to guess that it's going to have a very low win rate on 17 lands, because I think that people aren't going to appreciate, like, if it works at all, people aren't going to appreciate how hard you have to go out of your way to like set it up, and they're going to play it indexed where it's really embarrassing. Heroic reinforcements just seems so much more powerful than the other signposts. I think I agree with the closest competition being Tatiova. Obviously, they do very, 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 very different things, and they go in basically opposite decks. But Tatiova is a very serious card, and interestingly, I think both Tatiova and Heroic Reinforcements are very well supported. And it's certainly, I think, a good thing when a format can do both of those. Balmor, too. Yeah, Balmor is a pretty respectable signpost as well. I agree with that. But yeah, I think To some extent, it's tempting for me at least to kind of think of the format as defined by like heroic reinforcements and Tatiova as kind of the two opposite ends, and everything else sort of exists on the spectrum of like you need to be prepared for both heroic reinforcements and Tatiova and the decks that they imply. I think that that's like, if you want to think of like if it's helpful to think of two defining cards as setting the bounds of the format, I think those are kind of the perfect two to think of. I think that's a pretty good note to close on, since it's a concise overview of what I'm expecting so far. So that's what we have for now. I'm uncertain as to whether I will delay the recording of the podcast next week to Thursday to get more experience with the set. To be determined. But yeah, that's the first look at Foundations. I'm looking forward to playing with it and seeing how much I agree with what I thought here then. Bye for now.
Prepare for light speed.